Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Michele Heyward. Whoa, it is June. I'm loving this. I'm loving this. I love the summertime. Uh, Depending on when you're watching this or listening to this, maybe it's a completely different time of year for you. But if you are joining me live, please let me know in the chat. Um, Please let me know in the chat. Okay, so LinkedIn is doing what LinkedIn likes to do, which is say my event is not there. And that causes me so much stress because we are actually live. And then it says, we don't see you. And so what I am going to have to do is um go into LinkedIn and redo this. So bear with me. So tonight we're talking about um, the architecture, engineering, construction industry, how those leaders changing the glass cliff impacts underrepresented employees. And this is really important to have a discussion around because number one, when we think of corporate America and we think of glass, we're usually saying the glass ceiling, right? Bumping into the ceiling, something keeping underrepresented people from achieving success. What we may actually be seeing more times than not is also the glass cliff. And so once an underrepresented, marginalized person has made it through the glass ceiling, they're now standing on the glass ceiling and it can become a cliff. So, how does this happen? When does this happen? And actually, I noticed a lot of it during the pandemic, hoping for the best, not seeing it, hoping it would change, and hoping that when perfect. So we are live. I just had to make sure we weren't having more technical issues again this week. But making sure that what was happening as I saw more Black women, Latinas, Native women, people actually, and women overall getting promoted into executive roles, was it actually good, in a word? Was it performative? Were they being set up for failure or success? And so, what happens, or what is the glass cliff specifically? It is when organizations will hire or promote women and underrepresented people to executive roles during really stressful times. It could be an economic downturn. It could be the company is failing. It could be doing social justice movements or also a pandemic, right? Some really world global issues that are going on that may be impacting that organization. And you're like, well, why does this happen? They'll go ask white men and they'll look at what's going on with that organization and say, oh, I am not willing to take this risk on my career to do this role. And so white men will generally say no to the role. So all of a sudden, organizations can find capable candidates for the role because their preferred candidates are telling them no. And so this is where you see more women, you see more Black, Indigenous, and other people of color getting promotions into executive roles. But the risk of failure is extremely high. And what I mean by that, the company could be struggling financially. And so they don't have the resources, the employees, the money, the equipment to be successful. And in that turn, can make it much more difficult for them to actually make the company money, to actually be profitable, and to make things work out well. However, they generally want to take this risky role because they may never get this opportunity again. What I want to talk about today is how organizations should be setting marginalized people and women when they're on the glass cliff, the things they should be doing to help them succeed, right? To help them do well. And what I mean by that, often there's a gap in their access to certain information, to resources that they don't know they have or that even exist. And because of cultural differences being separated or segregated from what is going on in the organization, being over mentored and under sponsored, they don't have relationships, they don't have access to the things they need to succeed. And so when organizations realize that they are now looking at somebody who may not have they have the skill set to do well in the role, they may not have the knowledge or know what resources they really may need or what resources have been taken from them or limited for their success. And they should be advocating heavily for them to succeed. So I want to really focus on three things tonight. And I what is the glass cliff was number one. Because the glass cliff can look very similar but yet different in organizations, I want to delve into that for a few more minutes, and then we'll go to how does the glass cliff impact underrepresented employees, and then we'll round out, well, what can be done to mitigate the effects of the glass cliff. And so now they've broken through the glass ceiling, they're standing on the glass ceiling, and they can potentially go over. That's the visual I want you to have. They climbed the corporate ladder, is missing rungs. They've broken the glass ceiling, so they've been cut, they're bleeding. Now they've climbed through, they're on the glass ceiling because an opportunity opened up, but they have they have less resources and access than their white male counterparts. And it's doing a very stressful and high risk situation. So how can they be set up for success? What are the dangers? And so oftentimes, again, it's because white men don't want these roles or the preferred people don't want the roles. And we've seen this often play out, whether it's in politics as well as in corporate America, in corporate spaces. And so if you're not in the US, you probably are seeing this also in businesses in the country you're in, because I know we do get some international viewers and listeners as well. Now that we I think have a footing, if you have questions, definitely let me know. I would love to answer those as well. And so I want to take a minute and I want you to reflect on the glass cliff and what that has looked like. If you have seen a glass cliff or someone on the glass cliff, or put a 1 in the chat. If you have been on a glass cliff, in a glass cliff role, put a 2 in the chat. I think it's really important for us to have this discussion because it's like, what could I have done? And sometimes it's not what you could have done, it's what was done to you and how somebody else could have set you up for success. Okay. And she is on this, and underrepresented women is where I'm focusing right now. So she's on this cliff, and it's really important that you find a way to support her. And what I mean are white management teams in these organizations. It could be executive assistants, it could be human resources, it could be procurement. These are different people that have access to information and resources this underrepresented woman, Black, Latina, Indigenous, or mixed race really needs in order to succeed in this role. And getting her this information is number one. It is going to be key. All right. Okay. So you've seen somebody on the glass cliff. So we do have somebody, like I've seen somebody on the glass cliff. It's really important that we focus on, now that we know what the glass cliff is, now that you know what it looks like, And even if you're presented with a glass cliff role as an underrepresented person, you have to make decisions. And those decisions can be made and specified when you're going through the interviewing process, right? Whether it's identifying key performance indicators and goals they have set up for you, asking about access to certain resources. Also, as an underrepresented person, negotiating your package to leave before you're hired. Oftentimes, like, things don't work out. Now we're negotiating an exit package. You can negotiate your exit package on your way in. You don't have to wait until things don't work out. But I also want to, when we're talking about measurements of success as well, as an analytical person, as an engineer, we oftentimes get stuck with, well, the metric was this, right? Like, yeah, but your predecessor had all of these things. You had half of those, but they wanted you to hit the same goals. It doesn't make sense. And so you also want to get historical information and data of what was the previous performance, what was the access to certain resources. Because if they don't measure up, how are you supposed to hit the same targets, the same goals without, and in a maybe even a recession, when people are, and your buyers may not be purchasing as much. And so the goals have to make sense. And so that's one way organizations are setting underrepresented people up for failure. And this is where I want to talk to leadership, and is about this and the things that you have to change in order to set them up for success specifically. And I know it's like, oh, well, we don't really do that. Equity looks different for everybody. And sometimes, even though you're giving what you gave the predecessor, you may have to provide additional resources, whether it's in training, whether it's more staff, to the underrepresented employee that comes in. Too often, women won't ask for the help they need. And also, women heart attacks look very different than men heart attacks. And so it's really important that you sometimes help structure what they need when they're coming in, but but also let them know what additional support is available to them. And I know I'm a little bit off kilter off what I said I wanted to talk about. And I want to get back to that point, which is, now that you know what it is, what the glass cliff is, let's take a moment and really focus on not only how it's set up, but we know that white men won't take the roles, but sometimes resources are pulled back because organizations aren't sure how this new person will handle the role. It's really not up to you if you're giving them the discernment and the decision to run this operation, this business unit, this project, this team, the way they best see fit. That doesn't mean you can't have conversations making recommendations. But what happens is, oftentimes when an underrepresented person fails on a glass cliff role, it generally does three major things. In the organization, for some people, for some leaders and other people, it proves certain types of people should not be at that level of organization. They do not have what it takes to succeed. And I absolutely agree. They were not provided with the resources, right, they needed to succeed, because equity can look very different from other people. And so maybe they don't know how to read a balance sheet or all the 4 financial statements, and they need to be given some training and some support in that. And some people are like, well, they should have an MBA. Well, the 3 predecessors didn't have an MBA. They took a course. And so I think it's really important to understand what are some gaps you may see and how do you help close those gaps. And so you really have to figure out what is actually needed for the person to succeed as far as their experience and their ability to learn and grow, and sometimes at a faster pace. And so sometimes you need a different style team to support underrepresented people when they come in order for them to catch up. And other times you don't, depending on their experience and expertise in that field, in that industry, and sometimes with clients. right? And so it really is always going to depend on that individual, not on Black people, not on Latinos and Latinas. It's always going to really depend on that person on an individual level. So that's the one thing. Some people will use an underrepresented person's failure on a glass cliff as proof they can't do it. The second thing is they can get blackballed. Yes, that is really a thing. We call it something else in the industry. And so we already know it takes, or maybe you don't know, it takes Black people specifically and Hispanic, Latino people longer to find jobs. Statistically speaking, a white person with a criminal record is twice or three times as likely to get a job before a Black professional with no criminal record. And I want you to think about that. All the experience, all the credentials, and they still are less likely to get the same job than a white person with a criminal record. And so it's really important for organizations to take a look at the impact of failure on and how long it will take this underrepresented person to get a job, another role. And so you need to have something set like, hey, if you can't meet these metrics, and so you're always adjusting some of the KPIs and some of the goals as you see things fluctuate and change. So being more flexible helps as well, as much as you can. How does the glass cliff impact underrepresented employees? There are some good things too. So we talked about two negatives. It's proof for some people certain types of people shouldn't be at this level of job. It's going to take that underrepresented person. It could get blackballed, and third, it could take them longer to get a job in that industry again. I would say there are positives to an underrepresented person taking a glass cliff role. Number one, taking the role and making any positive change is success, because you have not been generally set up to succeed. You've been set up to fail. And so it's really important to understand that while they may have a 10% goal for revenue or productivity or growth in an industry, and you're hitting 1.8%, it's like, oh my God, I'm really below. The buying market has changed drastically, and your repeat customers are down by 80%. You having a 1.8% growth is really impressive when your previously repeat customers are not buying at the same level, is drastically lower. And I think you're going to have to go in and advocate for yourself as to why some of the goals and KPIs you have set up are not in your favor. And so you learn to become a better advocate for yourself. You learn to really know your numbers at a different level, and you're able to shine a light and really position yourself like, hey, I'm able to do this despite of that. However, I do not want you to hold on to one thing, having to do more with less. I love having these conversations. We have a saying from where I'm from, and let me know if y'all have anything similar like this. I can make $1 out of a dime and a nickel. I can make $1 out of a dime and a nickel. The sad part is oftentimes Black people and other underrepresented people have had to make the most out of a little bit. And when you're in corporate spaces, billion-dollar, trillion-dollar companies where they have set you up for failure and reduced access to things, you should not tote on your ability to get things done with less. And people are like, oh my God, you should, because they will repeatedly take resources from you because you are succeeding with fewer things. Instead, you should reposition like, because I was given this, I was only able to get these results. If you want me to provide more, you have to give more and show the projections of where you can land if they provide more. Showing them you can do well with less generally is a negative that is used against us. Like, oh, well, since you can come up and hit 5% with 20% of the resources, we're going to cut that 20% to 10%. Now, what can you do? They're going to continue oftentimes because you're set up to fail. Also, talking and building a community of other executives that are in similar industries, that are you identify with racially, gender wise, family structure, education can also help you figure out where you have blind spots and have not realized things you should be receiving, information you should be receiving. It is quite interesting how months later, people have found out they were supposed to be getting reports from a certain manufacturing facility which supplies certain parts for their products and services to be built. If they had gotten those reports, some of people would have found that the parts and materials they actually needed to support their products were actually being manufactured on time. They would be billed to them because they were sitting on a plant floor and somebody had accidentally forgotten to ship them out on time for them to meet their numbers. People will significantly and intentionally set you up by not giving you information you need. And so sometimes it's good to start really doing a network map of what information you need and where does it lend out to. Who does it lend out to? What facility, what group, what team? It can get kind of confusing, but at first, it'll be a lot. But after a while, you'll start realizing you have a lot of red dots, nodes that need to be green in order for you to hit your targets. And so really reframe and understanding where the gaps are. Now, once you've identified this, if an executive in your organization has not come forward and has not addressed these gaps, because sometimes they know, sometimes they don't, it's important to bring them up. And you have to decide if you want to bring them up in a one-on-one conversation, in a team meeting, to address them. If you have gone different ways to try to get this information, is really important. And so I want to flip this and go into the third point, which is what can be done to mitigate the effects of the glass cliff. This is not for underrepresented people to do. This is not the work for us to do, right? First of all, we should be set up for success. But because people don't know the difference between equity, and equality, sometimes giving the same thing to somebody as a predecessor who was a white male is not what I may need as Michele as a Black woman, right? And so you really have to understand what that looks like, number one. Number two, making sure those white executives really set up KPIs and goals, KPIs, key performance indicators, that are actually measurable and representative of the resources you have. If you did a RIFT, a reduction in force, and you have a smaller team, sometimes you let go some of your more senior experienced people who actually have relationships with vendors, with internal stakeholders, right? Those relationships aren't there anymore. And so the junior staff can do the work, maybe not as fast, but they're missing key information and relationships to be able to do it most efficiently and to remove barriers. And so organizations don't always think about that when they're doing layoffs. And so in you come like, okay, well, I have a great team. They have all of these degrees. They've been here 8, 12 years, but the person had 22 years, 34 years, that still had another 10 to 12 years before they retired, was laid off. But they had been with the organization for so long, they knew who was who, all the players, sometimes where the information really was not on the computer screen, it was on a clipboard down on the manufacturing floor. And they knew to go get there because one, they may have started their career in the organization on that plant floor and still knew a lot of the old processes were in place. And so it's up to those executives that when they bring you in, that they have somebody to walk you through these processes. So while you may not be managing them, you understand that some of the key stakeholders and some of the key employees are no longer there to run this information, and there are going to be lags. That's number one. Number two, giving you the ability to build your team. And what I mean by that is sometimes the person you need, if you are the very analytical person, maybe you need somebody on your team who's does better with communications and relationship building. Not necessarily a business development person, but somebody that can really communicate well. And I'm not saying yours is bad, but they do it at a higher speed and they're able to close that gap for you while you're learning the role. Having an executive say, hey, these are the 3 or 5 roles that you can hire for, or you're able to hire 3 or 5 people where you think you need them best. And it's like, well, we're on a hiring freeze for a underrepresented person, for a marginalized person. They're definitely going to need to build their own team to a certain degree, because they are going to need some different help. They're going to usually need different perspectives, because they're going to encounter different barriers than their white male predecessors. An organization like, well, we're on a hiring freeze. You have to set them up for success. So figure out what does that look like. And it is not an intern, right? And they need to be able to hire that person. Like, oh, well, just pull somebody internally. That may work. I'm not going to say it's absolute no, but we really need to understand how to set them up for success. There are a few other things I want to get into before I'm absolutely out of time today, minus a few technical glitches. If you're in the AEC industry, one of the biggest things that always strikes me is that when we look at attrition among executives, the average attrition rate for executives is 5% in the industry. But when you look at Black and Hispanic or Latino executives, it's more than twice that. And so that's a huge indication there is an issue in the industry that hasn't been addressed, that needs to be addressed. Now, if y'all have any questions, drop them in the chat. I prefer to have a conversation than a monologue, okay? I really, really would. So the first thing I want organizations to do when it comes to the glass cliff is really focus on yourself to understand what racism and sexism is on an individual level. Like, you bring in plenty of trainings and you have your executive team goes through, but what does that look like for you? And really doing a program that is specifically built to address biases that you may have. And over the last few years, a lot of people have brought in trainings into their organizations, but oftentimes it's done as a group opposed to individual level. And people are like, oh, I'm reading this book, or I've read all of these books, but what does it look like for you to take action in the organization? So one is, of course, focusing on you understanding what racism is, because oftentimes white people are like, oh, well, but I'm nice. You can be nice and racist. You can be nice and sexist. And when it comes to the AEC industry, especially for somebody who worked on a construction site, the person that's the nicest sometimes to me was the most dangerous person for me to be alone with on a construction site, because I work, especially when I worked in very, very remote locations, right? It is very important. The next thing you can do once you started understanding what these isms look like, is coming into your organization and looking at what is going on with your executives through demographics, right? How long are people in certain roles, and what is their performance like? What feedback are their managers providing to you? Or how do I want to put this? And where can you identify some biases in the information that is fed to you about underrepresented executives, right? And really now having better discernment, so you ask better questions about the information that is provided to you from the person that's reporting to you, which may not always be them. It's really, really important. The reason I say this is oftentimes when they're having conversations about underrepresented leaders, they don't always speak in the best light. Or when we do something well, it's like they were so surprised we could read and write, when those are some of the basic things to do. Or they're really surprised when we're able to do something because they gave us 15 cents and we performed as though it was $1. And so it's really important to understand, like, well, I'm surprised they were able to do work as though they were at 100%, well, they were at 15%. Why are they at 15%? Remove the surprise of them performing well. Ask why they had to perform well at having 15% of what their predecessors had. And so really thinking more critically and asking deeper questions, not so much about their performance, but what is being reported to you about them. So you have a better picture. The third thing is going to talk to them yourselves, having closed door conversations and making sure they know that you support them and that you will provide the resources they need. You need to know what they think they need so that you can get them the right resources. This can become very, very political, I know. But again, if you're going to change the impacts of underrepresented employees in your organization, executives, C-suite especially, have to step in and be able and willing to take risk when they do this. Because what you're seeing is if you're not able to reduce the attrition of your underrepresented executives, you're going to keep the attrition of your underrepresented people about the same rate. It is not going to improve, because when they see people who look like them leave, they are more likely to leave too. And so it is literally a downward spiral if you're not able to improve in that aspect. What we have seen, and it's not just AEC industry, but across all industries, more white males who are towards the last 3 to 5 years of their career willing to take these risks because they're the last 3 to 5 years of their careers. They're willing to take that risk. They have nothing to lose. This has to happen sooner for 2 reasons. Number one, once they leave, the status quo comes back. And number 2, they have not been there long enough to make the cultural change through middle management. And so these executives have to do work at a deeper level, not just in an executive level, but specifically down to middle management. And then the last thing I'm going to add as to what needs to happen, what accountability, how to mitigate this, is really having accountability in the organization. This has been huge. We've seen NASDAQ try to roll out something about diversification of the employee base of your boards and what this would mean. And the pushback from NASDAQ trying to hold organizations accountable was horrendous. And these are the things that we know publicly, not even all the closed door conversations. So having accountability built into your organization is huge. And some organizations, they tie it to bonuses. I'm pausing there because you take away somebody millions, but you still pay them a few $100,000. They still get their base salary. And that's the accountability you have. So I want you to think, if you have children or maybe a pet, be like, if you don't do this, you're going to get your dinner, but you're not going to get your treat. Okay, I'll get my treat tomorrow. Or I'll do it or I'll find a different way around it. What is true accountability for people in your organization because they did not, that is not good. I am frozen. Hopefully y'all can hear me. Okay, at one place I am not frozen. So let's go with I'm still going. And so what happens when you're able now to have accountability in your organization is going to do two things. You're going to have more attrition, but not as much from underrepresented people. Number one. Number two, you're going to lose some information because generally you're going to lose white employees that are still going to leave for some information, some knowledge. And so either way, you're going to lose people, but the difference is what is the cultural change overall and long term for your organization. So that is what I wanted to say for the AEC leaders. Changing the glass cliff, impacts on underrepresented employees, understanding what the glass cliff is, because oftentimes we think glass ceiling and not glass cliff, but the glass cliff is when you're on the actual walking on the glass ceiling because you've broken through. How does the glass cliff impact underrepresented employees? There are negatives and there are positives. If you attended our Women of Color in STEM virtual summit earlier this year in February, we discussed how to flip into some of those positives and how to identify when you're in a glass cliff role or a glass cliff role before you get into one. And that way you know how to get out. And if you joined me last year, August, I talked about how to negotiate if you're on a glass cliff role, how to negotiate your way out. So we're continuing to have these conversations, but that was to underrepresented women. Now having these conversations with leaders in the workplace, especially white executives, is very important that you understand what the glass cliff is, how it can negatively impact underrepresented employees, but more importantly, how you can mitigate the effects of the glass cliff in your organization if you cannot prevent the glass cliff at all. It'd be great if you could remove the glass cliff, but I know just about 99.99%, because not even, as somebody said, hand sanitizer can't get rid of all the germs. Most organizations will not be able to eliminate the glass cliff at this point. So it's really important that we realize that and we move towards a space where you can identify and mitigate the effects of the glass cliff on marginalized and underrepresented people. Okay. Those are my thoughts. Architecture, engineering. Okay, cool. Architecture and engineering firms have an interesting place. If you are doing infrastructure work, marginalized people are usually highly negatively impacted in this space, whether it's around water, highway, housing, public schools, and hospitals. We are generally negatively impacted. And so it's really important to keep as many underrepresented engineers and architects in this space so that we voice out the concerns and the negative impacts of how things are designed, where they're implemented and built, and how it negatively impacts our communities. And not having these discussions and having us continuously leave the industry further negatively impacts our community, and it overall impacts all of the United States of America. So we're talking about $1 trillion impact, negative impact on people. So I really want to focus on why I'm doing Built by Women is to share the Black, Latina, and Indigenous women in this space of infrastructure here in the US, and that have been here 10, 20, 33 years. I have a speaker coming up this month that has been in Department of Transportation for 33 years. And we've been here, we want to stay, but a lot of things have to change in order for you to be able to retain us. And I say we because I'm a civil engineer, and I used to build a power grid, and now I'm working more on the advocacy side to retain talent like me, specifically in the AEC industry. So it's really, really important for me specifically to continue to have these conversations. So join me next week for another episode of Built by Women. We're going to be talking about talking to another woman out of infrastructure who is from my home state of South Carolina. She is actually also a graduate of the same university as me, Clemson University. And she will be joining me to talk about really how from humble beginnings to engineering success, how to power education and family, got her into college, into engineering, and she graduated to now have a 33-year career in the US Department of Transportation. And where she's focused right now is literally bringing in the next generation of engineers for the US Department of Transportation. So definitely join us. And then on Friday, if you're in HR, people analytics, you're a leader in the AEC space, I'll be doing a webinar. So it's not a live, a closed webinar on building a data-driven talent marketplace to retain and develop underrepresented employees. We can't speak up in the workplace because we get so much backlash for doing so. And so how do you then utilize technology to really understand our skill set and our abilities that we can't voice safely in the workplace? So join me on Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern time. So if you're on the West Coast, you have time, maybe you're wrapping it up a little bit early on Friday, just join in, listen in, and join the conversation as well. So everybody, I want to thank you for joining me. I will see y'all next week if you want to join me for the next episode of Built by Women. Bye, everybody.